Hi, I'm Chelsea of Friday Pattern Company, and today we're going to be making the Jia Surfsuit. This is one of our new sewing patterns. It's one of two kind of swim patterns that we just released, and we already did part one of the sew along where we just go over how to insert the center front zipper, because that is probably the trickiest part. So this is part two, and it's smooth sailing from here, baby. So yeah, I'm using just like a really nice kind of ribbed swim lycra that I picked up. If you want like a more in-depth look at details on the pattern, we have an intro video where we talk about this and the Twin Leaks two-piece pattern that you can check out. But yeah, I think that's about it. So let's get started. Okay, so here we have our front, and I'm grabbing my side front B pieces. And the way that you can tell the difference between the side front and the side back is that the side front has a single notch along this curved edge and the side back has a double notch. So that single notch matches up with a notch on the front. And I'm just going to pin this in place. I like to start at the middle and then do the two ends. Okay, and then you're going to use a 3/8 inch seam allowance to sew all the way down the length. You can use any stretch stitch here. I'm going to use a zigzag stitch that's 2.5 millimeters by 2.5 millimeters. You could even use a serger right here if you wanted. Okay, so I've repeated that on both sides, and here is that sewn. Now, the next step is going to be to push the side fronts outward, and we've got our seam allowance going towards the side front. And we're just going to top stitch right here, 1/4 inch from this seam, just going down this seam, catching the seam allowance underneath. And we'll repeat that on both sides. So here's what that looks like finished. You can see it on and then here's what it looks like on the back. So these next couple steps are going to be really familiar. So here's our back. And then I'm grabbing our side back pieces. And these ones have a double matching notch on this curved seam on the back and then also the side back. So we're going to pin these together, right sides together. I'll just work with this one for now. So again, I'm going to pin matching those double notches, and then I will match up each end and pin in the middle. So just like we did on the front, we're going to sew this using a 3/8 inch seam allowance and a stretch stitch, and then we'll repeat that on both sides. Here's that sewn, and then now we're going to do the same thing as we did on the front, where we push our sides out and our seam allowance is headed towards the side seam, and we're just going to top stitch along here and along here. And then there's that done. Here I've got my front piece, and we are going to now grab our sleeves. On the sleeve you'll find a single notch on the front and a double notch on the back. We're going to match up with our front first. And I've got my single notch here, so this goes right sides together, being pinned to this curve up here. Just like I did before, I'm going to start by matching that notch, and then I will match up the ends. A couple pins in the middle for good measure. I take this to the sewing machine, and I'm going to sew it using a 3/8 inch seam allowance, again with a stretch stitch, and you'll repeat that on both sides. Here are those sleeves sewn on. So now, same thing as we've been doing, we're going to top stitch this seam allowance, and so I've got it pressed towards my sleeve, going this way, and we're just going to top stitch along here and repeat that on both sides. There's that sewn, and now we're going to join the sleeve to the back. So there's my back sleeve, and here is my back. We've got a double notch right here. There it is. We've got a double notch right here, and then we also have a double notch on our back piece right here. So we're just going to match those up. Okay, so I'm going to stitch this And then I'm going to repeat on the other side, which involves bringing my other part of my back over here, and then we're gonna have like a loop. Okay, so here's the sleeves sewn on both back sides, and as you can see, we kind of have like a poncho at this point. We're going to push the seam allowance towards the sleeve again and top stitch along this back, and you're just catching your seam allowance and sleeve in this stitch. Okay, so now we're going to sew the underarm gusset, which is optional. This just gives you a little bit more range of movement. Yeah, if you don't want to sew it, you can skip ahead a little bit, but just going to take one of them, and they go to one layer of your sleeve. So there's a notch at these short ends that match up with your underarm seam, and then they just kind of get pinned outward like this. So what we do is we stitch using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. We're just going to stitch up, we'll pivot here, and then sew down the other side. So there'll still be a loose side to our underarm gusset. And I'm going to repeat that on both sides. So there that is, sewn in on one side. So I sewed it to my front. It doesn't matter if you start by sewing it to your front or your back. Now we're just going to continue with the instructions, and this is almost just like a part of our sleeve now. So we're going to fold our suit. Now our suit gets folded right sides together in half. We're matching up our side seams, and we're matching up our underarm seams. So I'm going to start at the bottom. When you get to this underarm seam, if you are sewing a gusset, you will just match this up, and then you start sewing, and then you're going to match this notch up with your underarm seam again. Okay, so here is our seam all pinned. We're going to start at the sleeve hem, so using our 3/8 inch seam allowance down to here. Be mindful when you get to your underarm gusset, if that's something you added, to just plop over onto that and then back down onto the side seam all the way to the hem. And we'll repeat that on both sides. Okay, there's that sewn up, and you can see we've got our little underarm gusset here, and turn it right side out. It's looking like a surf suit. Okay, this next step is pretty easy. We're going to turn our suit inside out, and we're going to match up the crotch seam on the front and back, and we're going to sew these right sides together using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Next up, we're going to sew our crotch lining in, and as you can see, this piece looks pretty symmetrical, but it's not quite exactly the same on the front and the back. So this notch is going to match up with your crotch seam, and then the shorter side with the notch on it goes towards the front of your suit. That's just like a reference thing. So we are going to pin this to our crotch, and we'll make sure that that single notch is going forward. So the forward is the side with the zipper. You can push that crotch seam back and match those notches up. And then you're going to sew along these sides 1/4 inch from the edge, and you'll do, if you want, you can also sew across the top and the bottom. So there's that sewn in. Next up, we're sewing the collar in. So you've got your collar, it's got short notches here, so you can fold in half at those notches so that you've got wrong sides together. And then we're going to pin it to our neckline. You can unzip for this, makes it a little bit easier. So the end, so you've got a couple notches. This first notch here is going to match up with this shoulder seam, and then you have another notch that's going to match up with your back shoulder seam. You have a center back notch that'll match up here, and then coming around the other side as well. So let's start at the center back, and we're pinning this right sides together. We're going to keep our piece folded in half. So this step we'll be sewing through 3 layers of fabric. And this folded edge matches up here. As you can see, these are a little bit shorter than the neckline on the collar is a little bit shorter than the neckline of your suit. So when you sew, you're just going to stretch a little bit in between each of these notch points so that it is flat, and then that'll help your collar sit correctly. Okay, so now we're going to sew these with our 3/8 inch seam allowance going around the neckline, stretching as we go. Okay, so here that is sewn in. And now we just need to fold this seam allowance down towards the body, and then we're just going to top stitch like we've been doing, 1/4 of an inch from the edge going around. You might have to just pull a tiny bit to get it flat, but don't pull too hard. You don't need to like stretch it or anything. Okay, so now the collar is in. Our next step is going to involve our leg bands. So our leg band piece is just a rectangle with a notch here. This notch isn't in the middle, so our front leg is a little bit shorter than our back leg, as you can see here. So just to make sure that this side goes towards your front, I have marked on the wrong side. I've just put a little piece of tape with an F on it so that I know when I'm pinning these in that this side is to be pinned onto the front leg, this side's to be pinned onto the back leg. So our first step is going to be to fold these in half right sides together, matching up these short ends, and then you'll just sew that using your 3/8 inch seam allowance, and you can repeat with both pieces. Okay, so here I have that sewn, and then I'm going to grab my suit. We're pinning this into our legs, and it's going to go right sides together, and there's only a notch on one side. So that side is getting matched up with, this notch gets matched up with your side seam on your hip. Okay, so it takes a little figuring because you want to make sure that your front end is going towards your front leg, and then this notched side is matched up with your hip, and then this seam is going to match up with your crotch seam. Now you'll notice that we've got a fair amount of the band is shorter than the opening, and that's because we need this to pull tight so that our bottoms stay on. So I'm just going to give it a pull and add some more pins in place. Okay, so now we'll take this to our machine and sew it using a 3/8 inch seam allowance going all the way around. As you sew, you're going to stretch in between your little clips so that it's flat and the band is the same length as the leg opening. And you'll repeat that on both sides. So here I have that sewn, and our next step, we're going to fold this band under to the wrong side. We're wrapping it around the seam allowance, and then we're going to clip it in place. We're going to sew right in this seam right here, and it'll catch this on the wrong side. This band is intentionally wide so that it can be trimmed, it can be easy to catch, and then we trim it away and we get a neat finish. So you'll see what we mean. But I'm just going to kind of clip this in place. You're going to have to pull a little bit as you sew to get your leg opening flat. So now we'll take this to the machine and we'll sew right along this stitch. You use a zigzag stitch or a stretch stitch just to go right along this seam and make sure that you're just catching this underneath. Okay, so here those are sewn, and now our only thing we have to do is to trim away the excess. What we need to do here is just trim close to the seam without snipping anything extra. And you can just do this carefully by kind of pulling it away and then working your way around. And you'll repeat that on both sides. Okay, so here I have the sleeve hem finishing band, and we're finishing it really similar to the way the leg finishing bands were. We'll sew them right sides together, and then we are going to pin them in place on the sleeve hem. There's a notch that matches up, and then the underarm seams match up, and then we flip it around and we stitch it. So here's that sleeve hem sewn right sides together, and then just like with the leg bands, you have to stretch it a little bit as you sew so that the sleeve hem is flat and the band will be stretched a little bit. You'll flip it around to the wrong side and you'll stitch in that ditch, going all the way around, catching the other side underneath. And then now all that's left is to trim away this excess. And then you have a nice sleeve finish, and that's it. Anyway, here is the finished suit, and I hope that if you are sewing along, you love your new surf suit and that you wear it while having fun outside in the water. And if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments down below, and happy sewing!